get started. Today we have Dr. Mukesh Kumar from Civil Engineering. And why you don't tell us, he's associate professor, so he came from Duke.
Right, yeah.
Can you tell us about, previous
What I do?
career and what did you do there?
So I should say I'm a geospatial hydrologist with a budding interest in eco-hydrology. And so just a few months back I had given a talk in civil engineering, so I thought that why don't I do something entirely new? And Natasha liked the title which I was suggesting.
He offered me 2 topics and I decided on this one. He was like, oops, I have to work on this.
Right. So, but that's good. That forced me to try to compile some of the old results and some new results. But since some of this is new, I solicit your feedback. So I look forward to that. Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot for having me here, Natasha, and thank you everyone for coming here. Today I'll be talking about unexpected hydrologic responses. And so the idea, what I will do in this talk is I will highlight 4 different examples. And using those examples, I will try to make a case that it's important for us to do refined characterization of processes and the interactions between them in order to predict our systems in a more definitive manner. Okay. And that's what I'll try to do. I have 4 examples, but given the time, I can shorten it, or I have 1 bonus example as well. So if you want, we can dive in there too. Okay. So let's look at the first example, which is about anomalous variation of evapotranspiration in snow-dominated settings. But before we get into snow-dominated setting, just let's try to think about what do we generally expect the ET to be as the annual precipitation increases. So generally what we expect in rain-dominated settings is that if the system is more wetter, that means we will have more soil moisture, which means we will have more evapotranspiration until and unless it's limited by energy, right? So generally what we expect is that, okay, as the annual precipitation increases, stream flow increases, and so does the ET, and then it plateaus at some quantity because there is not enough energy in the system. But now let's look at the result, the data from a snow-dominated system. So what I'm plotting here is 25 years of data of annual precipitation, and then on the y-axis I'm plotting ET plus net storage, which just comes from P minus Q, right? Because this is just the classic water balance of a bucket. And so blue dots or blue circles here are 25 years of data from Reynolds Mountain East watershed. This is one of the NSF critical zone observatory sites. It's in south central Idaho. And what we notice from the data is that it shows a decreasing trend. So instead of the increasing trend that I showed you here, what we find is that it shows a decreasing trend. Now here on the y-axis I'm plotting ET plus net storage change. Now we did not have groundwater data for 25 years, but we had it only for 3 years. And for the 3 years data, here I'm plotting 3 years data for 3 different locations in this watershed. So we have 3 different groundwater wells, 1, 2, and 3. And that data also suggests that a wetter year will have a higher groundwater table at the end of the year. Okay? Which means that in fact this is increasing, the net storage is increasing, but the ET plus net storage is decreasing. That means the ET is indeed decreasing in this watershed as the system is getting more and more precipitation. And so this is a very anomalous kind of variation in ET in a snow-dominated setting. And our goal was to understand why is this happening. So as is usually the case, what we try to do is first we try to use data and model synergistically, try to make sure that our model is able to simulate or capture the variations in the data. And so the model that we use is a PIN model, Penn State Integrated Hydrologic Model, which I developed, co-developed long back during my PhD. And in this model, what we do is, so this is the watershed. We divide the watershed into several triangles. So although this is a very small watershed, only 0.4 kilometers square in area, here I'm dividing it into 4,000 triangles. So that means 100 meters square average size of each triangle. And then in the subsurface, this triangle can have any number of vertical discretizations. And then within those discretizations, what we do is we try to write the partial differential equations of Wedo zone, groundwater flow, overland flow, soil moisture, all of it. So we try to solve all of this, applying Gauss's theorem, we convert the PD into OD, and then essentially we assemble all the ordinary differential equations from all these 4,000 triangles, and then maybe 5 discretizations in the subsurface. That makes 20,000 ODs, no, 20,000 triangles, and then 5 ODs on each triangle. So that's a 1 million ODs. We try to solve it, and that gives us soil moisture, groundwater, overland flow, evapotranspiration, all of these states and fluxes in each of these grids, as well as stream flow along the river. So once we do that, then we try to compare our results with the data, and as you can see, the model is able to capture, let's say, observed snow water equivalent, stream flow for the 3 years, soil moisture variations, and groundwater at different locations. Now, once we have confidence in the model, now what we want to do is to use the model to try to understand the system, that why the ET is decreasing with increase in annual precipitation. So for that, what we did was we used the model, and then we tried to just rescale precipitation amount in different years. So we did 25 years of simulation, and then we rescaled the precipitation in each of those 25 years. And this is the evaporation for different months. So this starts from October, November, December, and so you have May, so April, May, June, July, August, September. Okay. So interesting thing to note here is that the evaporation in summer months, it was increasing as was expected for rain-dominated settings. So it was increasing with higher precipitation amount. Okay, so I think I made a mistake here. So the colors represent different precipitation amounts. So the hotter colors are larger precipitation amounts. So again, going back to this top panel, what we can see is with increasing precipitation, the evaporation first increases, but then it starts decreasing, right? And so the question is, why is this happening? Why it was increasing and then it starts decreasing? And so this can be, conceptually understood using this simple equation, let's say, where I'm saying this is evaporation from the soil. And so that is, in some ways, is a function of soil moisture. So larger is the soil moisture, more can be the potential of evaporation. Then I have the potential evaporation term, which just captures how much the meteorological forcings are and how much energy is there to evaporate. And then I have this term, which is the shielding factor. So what is happening in snow settings is we have more snow, which means there can be more melt, which means we have more soil moisture, which means we have higher evaporation. But what is also happening is when we have more snow, the snow is on the ground for a longer period, which means it's shielding the soil from evaporation, which means it's decreasing the time during which evaporation can happen. So now we have these two competing controls on the evaporation that can happen. So, and that's what I'm showing you in these two panels, where this is the soil moisture. So as expected, larger is the precipitation amount, larger is the soil moisture generally after melt. But here I'm showing you the time of snow-free surface. So larger is the snow, smaller is the time for which the ground is available for evaporation. And so we have these two competing controls, an increase in evaporation because of larger soil moisture, but a decrease in evaporation because of decreasing because of decrease in time for which snow is available, ground is available for evaporation. And so because of these competing controls, what we end up getting is that there is an increase and decrease in evaporation in the snow-dominated setting. So this is a very characteristic response of a snow-dominated setting. And in fact, a couple of years after we did this paper, a really good paper came out by Ross Wood's group in the University of Bristol in Nature Climate Change, where they used Bodeko curve analysis from I think maybe 68 snow-dominated watersheds in US, and using that, they showed that because of climate warming, the total stream flow from snow-dominated watersheds will decrease. And an explanation of that is present here. So if we consider this snow precipitation as a surrogate for warming, which means that if we have warming, we will have a smaller snow amount. So essentially, if we have warming, we are going in this direction. So what we are saying is that if we have warming, we will have higher evaporation. And so we will have less amount of stream flow as a result of it. So that's very interesting. So that's where the implications are. But this result also shows that the result they showed is not universal. If there can be systems where actually, because of the warming, the stream flow can increase because the evaporation might decrease, because there are these competing controls. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll move on to next example about unexpected response. And this is again about a snow-dominated setting. So generally, when people are interested in how the stream flow amount will change in a snow-dominated setting because of climate warming, one variable that is of interest to them is stream max. So 3 is snow water equivalent, which is the amount of water in a snowpack. Okay. So what we are showing here is in October, let's say this is when the snow season starts, and snow keeps building up, and then once the summer starts or the spring starts, then the snow melts, and so the SWE decreases. And when the SWE decreases, that leads to stream flow response. So this is a typical response of or variation of snow water equivalent and stream flow in a snow-dominated setting. Now generally what the expectation is that because of climate warming, the stream max will reduce. Okay? So this is our expectation. Why it will reduce? Because the melt rate will be higher. Also many of the snow events will happen in form of rain, which will result in this peak to be smaller, right? So this was the existing knowledge before our work, where the idea is that, okay, climate warming will lead to a smaller stream max. Okay. But one understudied aspect of climate warming is that the precipitation regime is going to become more extreme, right? And a lot of people have studied this in rain-dominated settings. Because in rain-dominated setting, if you have more extreme events that can cause flooding, there has been a lot of studies on that. We wanted to ask the question, what will happen in snow-dominated setting? Because in snow-dominated setting, if you have a large extreme event, it comes in and it deposits, right? And so the question is that going to affect the stream max as well, assuming that the total seasonal precipitation is same? So what I'm saying here is, let's say if the total seasonal precipitation is 800 millimeters, in one case, if it happens as very lot of smaller events, and in the other case, if there are fewer but much larger events, will that result in difference in stream max, right? So that is the question we wanted to ask. And so obviously, you know, people have talked about that the extreme precipitation is changing throughout the US, and also in western US, where let's say here in the Sierras as well as in the Pacific Northwest, in Idaho as well. And so we wanted to see, will this have an effect on stream max or not? Okay, so in order to study this, what we did was we first developed a statistical model of precipitation using 25 years of data, and then we generated 9 different scenarios. So this scenario, so between these scenarios, the total precipitation is exactly the same first. The temporal variation of precipitation is also exactly the same. By that I mean, the precipitation amount that is in November is the same across these different scenarios. And now what we are doing is, let's say the precipitation, so amount is being modeled using a gamma distribution here, and so we just change the parameters in the gamma distribution to make sure that the variance is increasing but the total mean or the amount remains the same. So we have these different scenarios I'm showing you here, which shows more extreme precipitation from top to bottom. And so then we force this, these precipitation scenarios on a snow physically based snow model called Snowball, where we are trying to solve for, effects of energy, advection, so effects of, let's say, sensible heat, advective heat, obviously radiative heat fluxes, so all kinds of physics that drive the snow melt and accumulation. So when we did this simulation, so now here I'm showing you the results of 50 different ensembles. And on the x-axis, we have these different scenarios. Scenario 1 is more uniform precipitation. Scenario 9 is more extreme precipitation. And what we see is that the streamax is increasing with more extreme precipitation. So that means that if we have more extreme precipitation regime, we are likely to end up in a higher streamax, which means more stream flow at the end of the season. Right? So this is kind of opposite to what we would expect from climate warming. Now the question is, why is this happening? Why, because of more extremes, the streamax is increasing? So in order to explain that, we looked into the thermodynamics of the snow. And so here, what I'm showing you on the top is just the meteorological forcing. So let's say this is 200 hours of meteorological forcing. I think it's 10 days of meteorological forcing. So this is the radiation variation, and this is the air temperature. So every day the air temperature becomes higher than 0. At night it is lower than 0. And so in order to explain what is happening, what I'm considering here are 2 snowpacks, one which is 40 millimeters in depth, another which is 80 millimeters in depth. Well, not the depth, actually it was snow water equivalent of 40 millimeters and 80 millimeters. So even when we start from the same temperature of the snowpack, so let's say both the snowpacks are at temperature of 0 degrees, which means they are ready to melt, the cold content is 0. And so what will happen is, in a thicker snowpack, since the thermal capacity is larger, the temperature will vary slowly. In a thinner snowpack, thermal capacity is smaller, so the temperature will vary much faster in response to meteorological forcing. And that's what is happening here, where we have, let's say, in red is the thinner snowpack, and we can see the variation is much larger. Now, interestingly, the temperature of the snow cannot exceed 0 degrees, because after that, once the cold content is reached, it will start melting. So what is happening here is that the thinner snowpack, the temperature goes much smaller, but it cannot get higher than 0 degrees, right? So there is a ceiling at the top, which immediately suggests to us that the thicker snowpack is generally at higher temperature. The thinner snowpack is at lower temperature overall. Okay. So thinner snowpack is at lower temperature, which means that more energy can get in, right? If we look at the sensible heat flux, which is because of the difference in temperature in the air and the snowpack, we will have more energy coming in the snowpack. So since more energy is coming into the snowpack, what we end up getting is, so let's just look at the energy term, forget about all of this for the moment. So what we are getting is that the cumulative energy that gets into the snowpack is much higher for a thinner snowpack. Hence, more melt will happen. Since more melt happens, so there will be smaller streamax at the end. Right? So the thermodynamics kind of explains to us that more extreme precipitation regime will lead to a higher streamax, okay, at the end of the season. There are other reasons as well. Like here, I assumed that both the snowpacks are at the same temperature of 0 degrees. But before even they reach 0 degrees, let's say we have a precipitation event at -5 degrees C, right? So one event is smaller and another is much larger, a more extreme precipitation event. And so in that case, what will happen is, if you have a more extreme precipitation event which is at -5 degrees, it will require more energy to get to 0 degrees before it starts melting. Right? Which means that that's another reason why a thicker snowpack will melt later, right? Because it needs more energy just to get to 0. And in this slide I showed you, even when it's at 0, following that, a thicker snowpack will absorb less energy and so will melt slowly, right? So because of these reasons, what we end up getting is a larger streamax in a more extreme scenario. Now this is not always the case, this is definitely one very interesting scenario, but this is not always the case. In fact, when we consider climate warming with, let's say, more extreme precipitation, there are times when the streamax will actually decrease, right? And that's because even if the events are very extreme, but you can have rain events also very extreme. And so when the rain happens on the snow, so you can have rain on snow events, that can cause a lot of melt, right? And so there can be a decrease in streamax because of that. So we try to compile it, what are the possibilities in the Sierras in California because of this. So I know there are a lot of panels in this chart, but let me quickly guide you through some of these. So let's first focus on, so what I'm plotting here is dry regimes and from cold to warm regimes and dry to wet regimes. So different precipitation amount in Sierras and different temperatures for these mountains. So if I just look at, let's say, dry and warm regime, the red line here, this is showing us what happens when we have more extreme precipitation regime. So the streamax will increase. Instead of being here, the streamax will increase to here. But if we have warming as well, that's our black line. So what this is suggesting is that in certain scenarios, like in dry and warm setting, in those scenarios, the extreme precipitation will actually negate the effect of warming. So generally people will expect that because of the warming, the streamax will be here. So we were expecting streamax to be here, but now what we are seeing is, because of more extreme precipitation regime, actually streamax is much larger than what it was earlier. Right? So there are certain scenarios where more extreme precipitation regimes can negate the impact of warming. And so the point I want to highlight here is that, climate change is happening, but it impacts, it's very complex to predict it. And we have to account for a lot of different controls and interactions between processes to be able to say in a more definitive manner what the impact will be or how it will be realized. And so we have to account for that. Now, even in systems where it does not fully negate it, what we do see is that, let's say here, this is what the difference we would have expected, but now this is the difference we will get. Which means that at least extreme precipitation mediates the impact to a certain extent of climate warming. Okay, so this was my second example. Now let's jump on to the third one. This is a much more recent project, and this is about wetlands in prairie pothole regions of the mid-continent, of the North American mid-continent. So for some of you who are not aware of this region, it's littered by depressions, pothole-shaped depressions which were left by, let's say, Wisconsin glaciation. So as the Wisconsin glaciation retreated around 11,500 years back, the system was littered by these potholes, and the snow was left there, and then the snow melted away, and so it created all of these depressions, which now act as wetlands. And in fact, it was estimated that before Europeans moved in the landscape, around 80% of this region, 80% of this region was draining into isolated depressions instead of streams. So it has enormous hydrologic implications. Obviously, there are biogeochemical implications as well. These prairie potholes support waterfowl population, and if any of you hunt, you might know about it. I think it was in October. I was traveling to Saskatchewan, somewhere here, and you could see so many hunters from US were on the plains. So everywhere they were, hunters all around, and they were talking about, California going down the drain, and I was sitting there. So it was an interesting flight, but a lot of people essentially go there to do waterfowl hunting. Anyhow, so the question we were interested in is what has triggered the loss of these wetlands in the mid-continent, and we bumped into this data by Peckel et al., who have compiled. This is an amazing data set. I'll encourage you to have a look at it. So this data, essentially, it classifies water pixels across the entire globe from 1980s till now. Okay. So this is an amazing data set to do analysis such as how the precipitation flood inundation extent has changed, or how the lakes or wetlands have shrunk or expanded over time, things like that. So we use this data set which is available on Google Earth, and we plotted the inundation fraction over the years in North Dakota PPR. And what I'm showing you is monthly inundation levels and also PDSI, which indicates the wetness of the system. And expectedly, as we can see, that when the PDSI was negative, when it was in drought, the inundation fraction was much smaller, and during the wet periods, the inundation was higher. So this is expected. So in order to track how much or how many wetlands have been lost over time, what we did was we tried to look at every pixel, which is at 30-meter resolution, and we mapped when did this wet pixel stop being wet, right? And what we found was interesting, which is that most of these pixels, or a large fraction of the pixels that stopped being wet, were between 1995 to 2000. So just during that period, somehow most of the wetlands were lost in North Dakota PPR. Now, I'm not talking about what happened in Iowa, where it happened much earlier, things like that. But this is in North Dakota PPR. Most of the wetlands were lost between 95 and 2000. And the question is why that is the case. Now, the existing hypothesis was that maybe it is climatological. So generally, what happens is if the system goes through an extended dry period, then the wetlands are lost because it's an extended dry period, and the ecology there changes, and maybe people move in, and maybe it urbanizes, or essentially extended dry period encourages translation of wetland area to something else. But when we looked at it here, so this is our 95 to 2000, which was actually wet instead of dry. And then following that, there is a dry period, but then again there was an enormous wet period, but all of these pixels were already lost here in this period. So climatological, so this does not appear to be the correct hypothesis. Also, when we plotted how much loss fraction was in different counties in North Dakota, what we found out, so darker colors are higher loss fraction. It's not uniform. even though the climate is fairly uniform in North Dakota, which means that, again, I mean, this is not a climatology is not the culprit here. Then the another reason which people have often hypothesized is that there was an expansion of agriculture, and that must have led to loss in wetlands. But when we looked at the agriculture fraction, it is not changing much. In fact, in the later years here, it's reduced a bit, but agriculture fraction is not changing. But hidden in this data is the expansion of corn and soy. So what we are seeing here is, although the agriculture did not expand, but the corn and soy did expand around from 94 onwards, right? So there was an enormous expansion in row crops. So essentially, wheat, which is in green, that kept on reducing, and farmers started growing corn and soy because it was, they could sell it at higher prices. Okay, so our working hypothesis was that, well, the loss happened because of the installation of drainage by the farmers. So what must have happened is, because the wet period started from 1992 onwards, and the farmers, their field was wet for a longer period, so they realized, oh, our field will always be wet, we cannot use it, so they started draining it. And over the time, so they drained the landscape, but after, let's say, 2000, the system dried up. And so after that, it never recovered, because all of this landscape was drained. So this was our hypothesis, but there was no way for us to prove it. So we contacted Office of Water Protection in North Dakota, and they actually have the number of licenses they give for installation of drainage, like tile drainage as well as the surface drainage. And their rule is that any drainage that affects more than 80 acres of area, you have to get the permit. And so when we look, so in fact, they had the data from 1985 onwards, and it did not show what we were expecting. But the number of the total permits were only 2,400. And you'll see in many papers on in the PPR region, especially by F.E. Fufla, what they have shown from remote sensing is you will have more than 24 drainage ditches within a county itself. So what is happening is, it's not representative. Those permits are not representative of what is happening on the ground. And so we had to find a way to somehow capture or understand when did this drainage ditches were installed. And so for that, my student Chris, he found out this shape index, root A over P. So so this is suggesting, this is the ratio of the area of the wetlands. So square root of the area of the wetlands divided by the perimeter of the wetland, right? So it's a scaling term, and so what this does is, let's say this is where we were earlier, before pre-drainage, and after drainage, many of these wetlands, essentially they were drained, and so some of these wetlands became much more bigger. And so now what is happening is that the wetlands are becoming fewer and bigger, and as a result, root A over P is expected to get higher. So now what we thought is, we went back to the satellite data to plot what this shape index looks like. And so for that, we just did a simple Bayesian change point regression here, and we fitted the data for the entire period. And the Bayesian change point regression, what that gives us is, it identifies the year which, it identifies the year after which the coefficients changes, right? So which increases the posterior probability or makes it the highest, okay? And what we find out is, as you can see, after 99, actually, there was a jump in root over P. So this is root A, root P, so root A over P, that's the slope. So what we are seeing here is the slope is constant as the climate changes, but because of the drainage, then the slope shifts, right? So based on this shape index, we were able to capture the time when most of the drainage ditches were installed, which which supports this data set. Okay. So, and this is not only so true for entire PPR. Now, if you look at different counties, so let's say this is the county where there was a big expansion of the row crops, and here we can see there is a big shift. In counties where there was a smaller expansion of row crops, which means drainage ditches were not installed or there was no need to install it, here we can see there was much more, not much shift in the root A over P curve. And similarly, so what we also did was we defined a score for how much is the shift, which is defined by a score D. This is just the distance between these two curves. And if we plot the distance for all the different counties in North Dakota, what we find out is the counties where we had largest decrease in wheat, they suffered the largest increase in consolidation score. So what is happening in this system is it's not the agriculture expansion which is causing the loss of wetlands or the consolidation of wetlands. It's not even the extended dry period. In fact, here there is a human-climate interaction happening. There was an extended wet period which encouraged the farmers to drain their lands, and as a result, a lot of wetlands were lost over time, and which resulted in this state shift from the original A and P relation to an altered A and P state. Okay, okay. Well, I'll try to maybe quickly talk about the last example, and this is about tree mortality risks. Okay, so again, the expectation is, so like Bill Andrea has written many papers on this where he did the meta-analysis and showed that a lot of trees have died whenever there was extreme extended drought all across the globe. So these are number of species that were included and where the tree mortality happened. And so it's a known fact that during droughts a lot of trees die. And in climatology literature, a lot of people have talked about that, okay, if you have, because of the climate change, the droughts might become more extreme or will be, for a longer period. And as a result, the conclusions people or many researchers hypothesized that, okay, the climate change will result in higher risk of tree mortality, right? But it's not just the changes in precipitation regime and the temperature regime that is happening with the climate change. What is also happening is change in carbon dioxide and specific humidity and such. And so we wanted to understand, well, does this hypothesis hold or not? So in order to do that, first we need to understand what causes tree mortality, right? And so there are several different mechanisms of tree mortality, but two primary ones, and because I'm running out of time, I'll talk about, let's say, hydraulic failure and carbon starvation. So in simple terms, tree can be conceptualized as, let's say, you have roots in the ground from where the trees extract soil moisture, then you have pipes, which are xylem, which take this water to the leaves, and then depending on the vapor deficit, this water is expunged out to the atmosphere. So what can happen sometimes is that when the ground is very dry, but the vapor deficit is also high. So the atmosphere is acting like a vacuum, essentially. So essentially what we are saying is, hey, the vacuum is on, so it's sucking water out of the tree, but there is no water in the soil. What that will result in, it will create a very negative pressure in this pipe or xylem. And this negative pressure can lead to two things. One is either it can lead to collapse if the xylem is not strong enough. So that's called hydraulic failure. Or it can lead to cavitation or embolism, where what happens is that some of these xylems may not be fully opaque. So because of the negative pressure, it can suck in air bubbles, similar to embolism, the way it happens in our veins or arteries. I don't know the biology. Anyway, so essentially we'll have air bubbles. They will get in the xylem, and as a result, the water will stop flowing. and so the tree will die, because if the water cannot be transferred, they cannot prepare food, and the tree will die. The second mechanism is called carbon starvation, where what can happen is in some trees, actually they cannot create a huge negative pressure in the xylem. So if they cannot create a huge negative pressure, and if the stomata is open, essentially desiccation will happen. So what they do is they will close their stomata. But when they close their stomata, they cannot eat carbon dioxide, right? And so they die of starvation. So this is called carbon starvation. So these are two bigger, primary mechanisms that lead to tree mortality. And so what we try to do here is we try to represent these mortality mechanisms in a soil plant atmospheric continuum model. So in short, what we try to do is we look at the data and we develop models and try to understand the system. Right? So I'm essentially showing you examples in different kind of systems, be it hydrology, subsurface, ecohydrology, and so on. So here we develop this model where we have a soil water component, then we have a water transport component which is governed by cohesion tension theory. Then we have exchange of gases based on the Fickian diffusion, and then we have the photosynthesis based on Farquhar photosynthesis model, and the kinetics of the stomata that is governed by stomatal optimization theory. And all of this is connected to atmospheric boundary layer model, which allows us to understand or to explain the effects of co-occurrence of heat as well as vapor pressure deficit on tree mortality. Okay, so what I'll do is, so we did this analysis in across 13 biomes across the globe to try to understand what is happening. I will not get into this a lot. If you are interested, we can talk after this. But what I'll just try to highlight is this result. So essentially, we are showing results for different representative concentration pathways, which means for different intensity of changes in carbon dioxide in future. Now, with the changes in precipitation and temperature, and this is what has been studied earlier, yes, indeed, the risk of the mortality will increase. So that confirms with the earlier results. But what we also see is that with increase in specific humidity and carbon dioxide, the risks actually reduce. And that is because, let's say, the tree has to open the stomata to eat, so to say. And if you have a lot of carbon dioxide, then they need to open only small, amount of, so the aperture has to be smaller to get the same amount of food, essentially, right? And if the aperture is smaller, so they lose less water, so they have more, likelihood of survival. So essentially, they can eat more food without losing water, and when that happens, they can survive. So if we have a higher carbon dioxide, this is called carbon fertilization effect, that we will have smaller risk of mortality. And similar thing happens with higher specific humidity, because if you have higher humidity, then you will have less loss rate of moisture, and so they can survive. And in fact, interestingly, if you look at the different biomes where we have evergreen needle-leaf trees and deciduous forests and broadleaf forests, what we see in many systems, actually the risk is decreasing. So our understanding earlier was that the risk will increase because of increase in the intensity and the duration of the drought. But what we are suggesting here, that in some systems, not in, let's say, California, in evergreen needle-leaf, but in, let's say, ENF, so let's say evergreen broadleaf system in the northeastern US, or deciduous broadleaf in the southeastern US, the risk might be decreasing. Right? So again, what this highlights is that we have to account for everything. I know I'm misquoting David Bowie here, but in a different context, he said, "I don't want knowledge, I want certainty." But what I say is, the certainty is gained through knowledge. And so it is important for us to consider all the relevant processes and the interaction between these processes if we want to make a definitive prediction. Okay? So I'll stop right here. Thank you. questions. So I'm giving you the glimpse of the different things I talked about, if that helps you remind any of this. Yes, please. You.
So, because I don't understand, so the third project is really, really interesting because it has a lot of larger chemical implications. So, what I don't understand is when you plot those A and D, how did you plug in the drainage intensity of those plots? Like,
Right. So
can you go back?
yes. So we do. So we do not know what the drainage intensity is,
Okay.
but our explanation is that when there is drainage, that leads to consolidation, and if there is consolidation, it will affect this ratio, root A over P. And so we decided to look into root A over P. I'm not showing the results. We also did hydrologic modeling here, where we considered 1,000 wetlands of a given shape. And then we assigned probability to it that, okay, let's say there is a 10% probability that it will drain to a different wetland. And we did hydrologic modeling on that to try to demonstrate, and actually one of the results here is shown, where if we have larger drainage density, which means there is a higher probability of drainage, then that leads to higher consolidation score. So this comes from a hydrologic model result, which I did not show you here.
Okay. But for the previous graph,
Mm-hmm.
so the value is slow. So what are I don't quite understand what the X and Y.
Right, so let me try to do that. I know I rushed a bit. So here, P is so this is square root of area of all the wetlands in the landscape. This is perimeter of all the wetlands in the landscape. And that we can calculate just from the satellite data. So the slope of this line obviously is root A over P. And what we are showing is that the slope shifts suddenly around this period.
Okay.
Okay.
So you're trying to show the shape change.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so based on, so we have one data which shows that when most of the losses happen in the wetlands, and then our hypothesis was it must have happened because of drainage. However, we do not have fine scale satellite data or DEM or LiDAR to map all the drainages. Actually, the data is there, but it's an insurmountable job. I mean, there is LiDAR data, and a lot of people are now developing algorithms to find out drainage networks.
Do you have explanation why the drainage intensity doesn't correspond to the drainage license? Because you say you have the.
Oh, does not correspond to?
Yeah.
Well, actually, my student who worked on this, Chris Crapo, actually he's from North Dakota, and his dad was from USGS, and he knows all the farmers, and he has ranch, and he hunts all of that. And he said that as he walks in his field, so there are two things. One is it's all voluntary. So people who go around the field to look for drainage, they are farmers, and the reporting is all voluntary. And you can, I mean, one thing you learn while living in the US is you have a lot of smart people, so you know how to game the system. So if you set, let's say, 80 acres, you can always stop at 70 acres and create a bund and then start again. So that will make it two drainages right beside each other, but just separated by a small obstacle. And you can still satisfy this, right? So you just have to be smart to move around. So Chris always tells me that, in fact, just in his field, he can see 2,400 drainages. So yeah, that's why it does not correspond. So actually, we spent a lot of time talking to, that can anyone vouch for it? Like we can write personal communication, and obviously people in the government were, I'm not comfortable with doing that. But everyone said, yeah, it's there.
Anybody else?
Yes.
I know in Arkansas, they basically use aquifer water to flood the fields for waterfowl to
Sure.
land for
Mhm.
hunting. So that would be the opposite, basically, of draining it. So have you looked at that at all, researching what flooding the
Very
field would do?
interesting. No, I have not looked at it, but thanks for letting me know. I mean, that can be a good project to try to understand, because I can see maybe one can look at the signal of when they started doing it and what was its intensity. So that can be an interesting narrative in itself. Thanks.
I'm a little like lost in the units of this graph.
Uh-huh.
You have perimeter on the x-axis, and
Yes.
this, you have 1 exponential to the 8.
Right.
So if you have 1, it would be 1 4 times to the 8 meters. So that would be 100,000 kilometers as perimeter.
It could be. I will not be surprised, although I would not like to be quoted. But this area is entire North Dakota. So we are talking about millions of wetlands.
Yeah, but the x-axis, what is it meaning? Is the perimeter of all the wetlands?
Yes,
Is it
all the
branch
wetlands.
or-
No,
okay.
all the wetlands. So this means all the wetlands on the landscape. Mhm. Any other questions? So I'll just quickly plug one thing at the end of the talk, which is that, so essentially through these examples, what I've tried to show is that, you know, we try to build these detailed models, and based on that, we try to understand the system. And so there are many different kind of models, and all of these are open source. So you can work with me or not. You can just go and download from my website or send me an email to get an updated version. But we have models of integrated hydrology, surface, subsurface flow, stream flow. We have models of hydrodynamics and contaminant for dam break kind of situations. We have models of radiation kinetics. That's for a project we are working on, where we are trying to understand how vegetation density affects snow melt. I showed you this soil plant atmospheric continuum model. If there is an interest in trying to understand how the soil moisture of the ground affects the vegetation and vice versa. We have model for sediments. So actually the sediment model is in here as well for hydrodynamics, but we have watershed scale distributed sediment models as well. And then there are a lot of statistical tools we have, which I do not understand, and my fabulous student Yang Liu, she develops it, but I can, you know, connect with you, connect you to her. Okay. So yeah, feel free to contact me in that regard. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.